I do not have any recordings for this, but I first start with grabbing a pipe mesh and scaling it up by using the scale tool by clicking R, and I created that as the wall. I also created pathways by grabbing another pipe, scaling it down, flattening it to almost like paper thin. I'm grabbing 3 of the 20 edges. I think I actually scaled it up so it's an even number, like 18, and every six I grab one of the side ones and extrude it outwards to create the 3 pathways, dividing the city into 3 sections. With the ground, all I did was grab the poly plane and extruded it, well, scaled it outwards to cover the perimeter or the area of the wall, and that's how I created the base layout for the environment. I built versions for House 1 and House 2 first. I do not have video recordings for this, but I had to remodel them because the dimensions for both of them were out of proportion with one another. I first created House 1 by grabbing a cube, scaling it outwards on all directions, grabbing the one of the sides, extruding it outwards, then then stopping, extruding again to create another face, and just extruding it forwards. For House 2, it was a bit more difficult. All I did was well, a bit more difficult. I grabbed another cube, I selected the top face, extruded it up and scaled it inwards to give a diagonal like shape to it. Extruded it again to have its long like neck. Then I extruded it a couple more times to give the rounding out part as almost like a lookout tower. How I created the top slash roof part of it is I grabbed another cube, scaled it down to make it more of a cuboid, selected the top face again, extruded up and inwards, and repeated that 2 more times to give more of a tapered top to it. For House 3, all I did was did the same thing that I did for House 1 and House 2, grab a cube, extrude it upwards, and click extrude again and extrude it inwards. Then select the outside faces that I created and extruding those up to give more of a balcony slash roof edge to it. For House 2, it was easier to do because all I did was grab a cube, select the top face, and just extrude it upwards. Then I created some stairs, which was my first time creating this. So I looked up a tutorial on how to make easy stairs, and how they showed me was grabbing a polyplane, having the dimensions 10 by 10, and selecting half the faces in diagonal, get rid of them, and then deleting all the vertices and all the edges inside the model, inside the polyplane I already had, flipping it onto its side so it's standing upright, and selecting the black inverted mesh face, I extruded outwards to create the stairs. And then from there, I created the doors by doing quad draws and extruded them inwards to give more of the indent look of doors. For House 4, it was a lot more difficult. I first got one cube, extruded it outwards on the back, then I extruded it again on the left, and then I then duplicated it onto I flipped it over, stitched the two together using target weld. Then I selected the top faces, extruded it upwards. Well, I selected the right side of the thing, extruded it upwards a bit to give more of a rounded to one house. Selected the right side, extruded that upwards as well, giving a higher point. And then in the middle, I extruded it upwards a bit more, so it's almost like tapered. So from left to right, it's tallest to shortest. In the middle, I did a quad drawn around the outside, selected that face on the left, extruded the mesh into the center, giving more of a balcony. Got another cube, extruded that upwards, well, scaled it upwards and shrunk it to give more of a post. And I used one for the base below the balcony and then one for the roof for the middle house. And then I also grabbed a barrier by doing the same thing I did for the post, but the opposite way. And I also created balcony pillars by grabbing a cube and extruding it twice, once straight and the other extruding it upwards and inwards, creating that tapered top. I also UV mapped House 1 and House 2, but I I also UV mapped house 1 and house 2. These were helpful because as I did them first, I could show a visual representation of what the texture would look like within this environment as I duplicate it more and more throughout the houses, and also I could see what my texture would look like in the future. I was originally going to put the temple in the center of the 3 walkways, but after realizing that I had other plans and it would look better if it was at the back, well, I pushed the platform for the temple to the back third of the environment, and instead in the center, I decided I was going to add my sand snake as a statue, almost like a guardian of this city. Continued to grow the city, expanding it upon the the section I was doing. Uh, I also wanted to see if I could duplicate certain parts of the city, seeing if I could speed up the process or not. But after doing that a couple times, I realized that it would look more natural if I keep on placing the individual one by one. But later on down the line, I did decide I would duplicate the whole left side and put it onto the right just to speed up the process as I was running out of time. Back earlier, I said I UV mapped houses 1 and 2, the smaller one, and the tower. The reason I did this is because I wanted to create a paint texture back in one of my other previous units. And I created a sandstone texture. So I UV mapped, I imported the UV map over to Adobe Fresco, the software I use for painting textures or drawing normally. I laid the UV map over the texture I created and erased all the stuff that is outside of the texture. And then once I did that, I imported them back to my PC and imported them into Maya to see how they would look. And it created more of a realistic feel, or more of a realistic feel than what I have currently, where it's just one plain color. Along with the UV maps and textures for houses 1 and 2, I also created market stands, 5 of them to be exact. A blue, red, orange, green, and purple one. These would give more of a coloristic and lifelike feel to the environment, and making them stand out, or making these settlements stand out than just being one basic color throughout this environment. After putting textures on houses 1 and 2, I started seeing issues that was arising from them. The main issue was you could see through the models, through the tearings of the gaps, which I don't understand and still, which I didn't understand and still don't understand how this has happened, because I grabbed the exact same UV texture, UV map and texture, put them together, and it still wasn't working. So instead, I grabbed a realistic image of a sandstone brick texture off Google and did the same concept of me importing it into Adobe Fresco, putting the UV map over it, and erasing the parts outside the UV map, making them transparent. This actually looked better and also didn't create as many issues as what I saw, but I did change it in the future, and I will come to that later on. After I created the market stands, I started incorporating them within the environment, placed them in within settlements, and even on the right hand side, I started creating almost like a market, like shopping center. But later on, I scrapped this because as I said, I was running out of time. So I decided to scrap it and instead place them down the aisles of the pathway, so it can still give some sort of like not supermarket, but like shopping center feel, but still has the aspect of the cities and the houses all without and around it. After I sorted out the main market issue, I then grabbed the template for the temple. Well, what I mean by that is like where it would go, and I moved it, and I started expanding it or extruding it out so it fits the third where it sits. I also selected all of the watchtowers and moved them to either side of the pathways, the other two pathways. But later on, I decided to scrap it because it would the ones within the temple third. Once I created the whole of the first side, or the left side of the city, I then separated all the parts for houses 3 and 4. So the parts for house 3 was house 3 small, stairs, and house 3 tall. And for the house 4, it was um, house 4 balcony, and house 4 balcony barrier. And then I did a UV map of every single one of these. Some were quite easy, like the barrier of house 4, but some were really hard, like the house 4 itself. So I had to even retopologize house 4, making it easier for me to work with. But later on down the line, I didn't actually use this because uh, the mesh was clipping in with one another. It was just not flowing well, and as it was literally going up to less than 48 hours before this unit had to be in, I just scrapped it, and instead I went into a different approach, which I will talk about later on. Even though I said I didn't use the textures that I created, I still textured them by, of course, in the same process I did, which was exporting all the UV map files into Adobe Fresco that I could use on my iPad to draw all the textures in, then export them from Adobe Fresco over to my PC so I could use them into Maya. And this is where the issue came along. This issue, of course, being how the meshes or the UV maps did not match up with one another. It didn't flow as well as I wanted it to. And same issue that happened with my version of the UV map. Well, my version of the texture for houses 1 and 2 happened with these 2 houses as well. That's why in the end I just scrapped the whole thing, because I realized there was always going to be ripping. There was always going to be tearing within this file or within these textures. Something I also did while I was doing the UV maps is I also remade the statue and rigged the sand snake again, because as I loaded up a different file because another one was broken, I had to go back and remake it, which what I did. And how I did it was binding the skeleton to the mesh and selecting every individual joint and turning it and spinning it around into a snake that has coiled itself up, and then the head is sticking up and over towards the center down the middle aisle. After I created that snake, I started to realize that the file was becoming way too big for me to import. I realized at this point this file was becoming way too big in general for me to work in or me to do anything in. I could still do stuff in it, but I could not remodel or model anything new. So I using export selection, I exported the wall into one FBX file, and then the what was it? I also selected the temple template or base and did export selection as well on this into another FBX file that I'll create another model out of. For the city wall, the city gate that I started off first was I imported the FBX file that I made from the original file into a new scene. I grabbed a cube, placed it next to the um, front gate. It scaled it upwards so it would be a bit bigger or wider than the gate itself or the wall itself. And first started off by scaling it down on the top part, creating more of a cuboid, selecting the top face and extruding upwards and inwards, creating an indent or slope inwards, extruding upwards, and then doing the same again by selecting the top face again, extruding upwards and outwards the same length out to create almost like a divot inwards, and then selecting the top face again and extruding upwards. And then in order to save time, I selected, once I did that, I object selected, Control D, selected Control D to duplicate the model. Snap rotated it so it's above, and using target weld, I target welded the two faces together, deleting the middle edge to save time and also create the gate. Gate frame. I used the gate or created the gate by just grabbing two polyplanes either side, so the black inverted mesh is facing on the inside, and texture both of them to have the same texture of a wood painted texture that, well, a wood painted texture that I got inside of Maya, and then I also painted instead of UV mapping and texturing, I painted the gate frame as a marble texture, and then readjusted the colors to look like red, like sandstone type. To create the temple base, I did the same style of what I did with the gate frame, which is I grabbed a cube and scaled it downwards to make it almost like a cuboid, selected the top face, extruding up, um, well, scaling inwards, selecting the top face again, extruding up, and did the same thing again to create almost like a stacked pillar type instead of like a inverted inwards and outwards one, kind of like what I did for the gate. Then once I did that mesh, I scaled it down to make it flatter and put it on every corner of this template I had, and grabbed another, selected the main temple base and put it on top, almost like a pillar standing upon, well, the temple standing upon stands for the temple. I also created the stairs, tried extruding outwards and downwards, but then it started looking weird and I started getting inverted meshes. So instead, I used the exact same technique I used for the stairs on House 3, where I selected a polyplane, did 10 by 10 subdivisions, selected half the diagonal ones, got rid of that, got rid of all the edges within the polyplane that I already had within the mesh, and got rid of the extra vertices, and then extruded the inverted mesh side to create the stairs, and properly adjusted it so it's the right length, height, and width for fitting in this space. I then grabbed the I then grabbed another cube, placed it down, extruded it inwards and outwards, creating a pillar again, but a different style one. And then once I got two of these, I placed them either side of the stairs, combined the two, then selected the top faces of both of them and selected the bridge tool and bridged them together. To give like almost an arc underneath it, almost like a support, I grabbed a cylinder. I cut off half of it. I selected the bottom edges, selected fill hole tool and completed it as a whole mesh, and just scaled it upwards to give it more of a wider, longer feel. And then by duplicating this model and extruding it outwards so it's thicker, I indented it into the other one and selected one, then the other, and did the Booleans tool, A to B, and it gives more of an arc feel. And then to lead upon that, I grabbed a basic cube again, flattened it down, and extruded it upwards and outwards to give almost like a window pane feel. And I did that for all of the edges on the bottom floor except for the front gate. Once I created that, and it was all done and dusted, I grabbed the original template for the temple base extruded it upwards, so it's still hidden behind the arches, but it's there and it's planted. Then instead of doing the same design again, instead I grabbed a cylindrical object, and extruded it upwards, and then placed it in the gaps of where the two arches meet for all the top places, and did the same thing with the window panel again, and made it fit within within the spaces of the pillars. Once I created that, I grabbed the template base again, placed it on top, hid it within the pillars, and then on top, I wanted some sort of like symbol that would be like worshipped within the city. So I did the same style of what I did for the statue base, which I grabbed another cube, extruded it upwards, inwards to give the indent, did the other side, and then selected the top face, extruded it upwards, selected it again, did the upwards and inwards, then inverted it for another section, then tapered it off, flattened it out so it gives more of a depth but doesn't give too much depth. Then for the corners, almost like stabilizers, I grabbed the cube again, extruded the top face upwards, inwards, and tilted it slightly towards like the 45-degree angle. I kept on doing that 3 or 4 times, then duplicated it 4 times, and then rotated it towards the stat or the template base of the worship symbol almost. And then I grabbed a pipe instead, um, rotated it on rotated it 90 degrees so it's flat, and instead of I also beveled it so it would smooth it out a bit and colored it blue to give more of a realistic feel. My original goal was going to be that was the way of highlighting my environment, but after rendering it within Arnold, I realized that it wouldn't render correctly, or the or the light from it wouldn't show within the whole area. So instead, I scrapped the mesh light and I just textured the base of the temple, same marble texture that I did for the gate frame for the wall. And for the windows, I did a glass texture, and for the circle, I was going to do almost like a water texture, but I realized that as I was struggling on rendering sequences and all that, it wouldn't work properly. So I just rendered it as a normal blend object, so it would reflect against the light that I was going to put into the model, and then I exported both of the gate and the temple into Maya back into the environment. It did take a good 10-15 minutes to export each one in, because at this point it got to over 600,000 polys, because as I didn't think about it, I didn't optimize my environment at all, so I was working on the maximum amount of polys possible. And once I did this, I placed them into the correct areas, adjusted it, and also got a directional light and pointed it towards the floor and did it that way. After I rendered the first lot, I came across an issue that some of the textures weren't loading, or the UV textures just weren't working in general. So I decided that instead of having the UV textures and all that, I would instead go with painted textures, like the one that I did for the temple and the gate. So I created a painted texture of rock for the houses 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then for anything wood-like, so like the stairs, the log beams, the barriers, anything like that for the houses would be as a painted texture instead. These did make it harder for me to work on my model, but I'm glad I chose it at the end and not the start, where I would be struggling to pretty much do anything. After I did this, I did render it one more time, and no textures were clipping at all, but the log texture was not lining up, or wasn't working, so I had to go into Hypershade for Arnold and work out what was happening. I just reloaded the texture and it was working again. I then also set up the directional light, changed the intensity and all that, so it would give more of like a sunlight onto the model. And instead of rendering in Arnold, I rendered in Maya's Viewport 2.0. Turned off all the natural lighting that the model gives already, and so it just uses the lighting I created with the directional light.